In this video, I'm going to give a basic introduction to structuring presentations. If you're already very confident in structuring presentations and have done this successfully in the past, this probably isn't the video for you, and you probably want to fast forward to the end of the presentation where I've suggested another resource, another ebook that might be of more interest. So this is a basic look at how to structure presentations, which has come from some of the problems that I've seen students having in presentations. In our academic writing, we're used to the idea that you need to carefully structure your work, in organising it carefully into paragraphs and also having an overall message. It's exactly the same in an academic presentation. You need to have a clear overall structure and to divide your ideas up. There needs to be a clear sense of a beginning, a middle, and an end. Exactly what this will look like will depend on the length and the type of the presentation. But in general, for example, the beginning, we would expect to find out what the topic is and who is presenting. The title should clearly reflect the topic of your presentation and be written in a way that's accessible to your audience. Abbreviations and acronyms can be really off-putting unless they will be widely understood. It's important in your introduction to set the context and in particular explain why this topic is important. You may also need to explain key definitions of the scope of your research or project. By scope, I mean what are you covering and what aren't you covering. It's also useful to end with an outline explaining the structure of your presentation. The middle of the presentation is where most of your content will come, and therefore this needs to be carefully organised. In a written assignment, you would organise your ideas carefully into sections and paragraphs, with each paragraph having its own specific main idea. It's the same with presentations. Ideally, you should think about what the purpose or main idea behind each slide is, and the title of that slide should represent that idea. Using language such as phrases or sentences or words to help signal the relationship between ideas on a slide and between slides is really important to help the flow and get the overall message across. And it's obviously important for your presentation to in some way feel like it's come to an end rather than your listeners suddenly being dropped off. So now we're going to look at some of that language that you can use to help direct and guide your listeners. In the introduction, you should start with some sort of polite, professional welcome. Something like a simple good morning, good afternoon, today I'd like to talk about would be fine. Ladies and gentlemen would be too formal, and hi guys would be too informal. At the end of the introduction, you will normally give the outline or the structure of your presentation, which might sound something like this. My talk will be divided into 6 main parts. First, I'm going to give a brief picture view of how mobile phones work. Then I'm going to look at some of the key areas in more detail. These are cellular radio, which divides an area into cells, multiplexity, which divides frequencies, and the use of different channels. Then I will look at some of the key pieces of infrastructure, in particular base stations and the mobile telephone switching office. At this point, when you then move on to your first slide of the middle or the main section, it's important that that slide is the first point you just said in the outline that you're going to cover. So in my case, the example I gave, it would be the brief big picture view of how mobile phones work. This might sound really obvious, but I've seen lots and lots of presentations where a student has given a clear structure at the end of their introduction, but then moved on to the first part of their content and it's not matched up. They've gone on to give more background, introductory information, which has really lost that flow and that direction that they had just set out. We know that signalling language is useful to help guide our listeners, but it would be a good idea to think about what language you're going to use to help transition between slides and what language you will use within a slide. Otherwise, this can become a bit confused and not be the most effective. So, for example, I've often seen students using that firstly, secondly language both between slides and within slides. This gets quite confusing because you end up with firstlies, secondlies, and it just gets a bit muddled. The language stops being so effective. So I'd recommend thinking of some phrases that you use just for between slides and some that you use just for within slides. When moving between slides, rhetorical questions can be really effective. So, how do mobile phones work? You can also use phrases like, let's look at how mobile phones work. Now I'd like to turn to look at how mobile phones work. Within slides, maybe you could focus more on some of those shorter linking words rather than whole phrases. Firstly, secondly, however, those sorts of things. And then you'll want to signal that you're moving on to your conclusion. So you could do something like, in conclusion, I've shown that, or just, I've shown that, blah, 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 because the tense would suggest that you're moving on to a summary. At the very end, you want to really draw it to a close. So that might be using a phrase like, this brings me to the end of my presentation. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. If you know you're going to have time for questions, or something like, this brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening. So in this video, I've given a basic introduction to structuring your presentation. You need to have a clear overall message as well as dividing your ideas. You should think about the signalling language and try to differentiate between signalling within a slide and transitioning across slides. If you are really confident with all this already, then you might want to have a look at this Nature Education's ebook, which maybe can give you some more ideas. But I'd only recommend doing this if you're already confident and experienced in putting into practice the points I've already discussed.